came to coin the modernist style label Post-Impressionism. In 1910, he had organised an exhibition at the Grafton Galleries in London, showing a cross-section of recent continental art. When pressed by journalists to summarise the character of the exhibition, he, as it were, conjured up the label Post-Impressionism. From the outset, it would seem that there was a contradiction in what Fry intended the term to do. It was to mark a clear distinction between works such as this, Gauguin's Fa et Hé, and the works of Monet, Pissarro, and their contemporaries. Fry was anxious that such works were judged on their own terms, and not as weird deviants from the Impressionist school. But at the same time, the term was chosen because it was vague and non-committal, and, we may suppose, because it had a familiar ring to it. Although his English audience was largely unaware of contemporary art movements, it was not entirely ignorant of the works of Manet, seen here, and the Impressionists. So to understand what Fry meant by the term Post-Impressionism, we need to ask what was generally understood by the term Impressionism in England in 1910. In France in 1874, if you recall, the term Impressionism was originally coined as a joke or smear word by a journalist in response to seeing works such as this, Monet's sketch impression Soleil Levant, at the first exhibition of a group of independent artists. Most of the artists accepted the term as a reasonably appropriate characterization of their aims. So what were the common formal characteristics of the works of Monet, Renoir, and their contemporaries that the term singled out? What differences in their works did the term gloss over? And what aspects did it ignore or avoid altogether? Firstly, there was the business of colour. Critics were struck by the brightness of the colours and absence of traditional tonal modelling. Anthea Callan has shown the technical reasons why paintings such as Renoir's La Parisienne or Monet's La Grenouillère appeared so luminous and brilliant. The artists had abandoned bitumen and largely suppressed earth colours from their palettes, suggesting form through contrasts of warm and cool hues rather than through tonal gradations. They favoured opaque, light-reflecting colours rather than transparent glazes. Compared to the dull tonal palettes of their salon contemporaries, even a painter of modern Paris such as Gounod, seen here, these paintings seemed startlingly garish. Critics also noted a direct, unembellished approach to nature on the part of the landscape painters, a predilection for sunlit scenes, and an avoidance of nature in her more dramatic or sombre moods. Pissarro's painting of the railway crossing is a good example of this general tendency. They were also felt to have a predisposition towards the ephemeral, rather than the stable and enduring motif. They were seen to prefer effects that involved mists, breezes, water with its reflections, and large expanses of sky. These effects, which are clearly visible in Monet's Autumn at Argenteuil, were noted by approving and disapproving critics alike. Again, these apparent challenges to accepted notions of composition, which contemporary critics saw as willful rebelliousness on the part of the painters, can also be seen, as Anthea Callan has shown, as understandable responses to changes in the materials available to them. Plein-air painting on an easel scale only became feasible once oil paint began to be sold in collapsible tubes, and plein-air painting on this scale made its own new demands on the ways of seeing and structuring landscape. For example, in Pissarro's Hoarfrost, the Old Road to Henry, one of the paintings he exhibited at the first Impressionist exhibition, the spectator is given none of the conventional devices to lead into the landscape, but is presented with an uncompromising expanse of frost-covered furrows. The shadows cast full across the land by trees situated behind the spectator add a further disconcerting element to the design. But such absence of structure is an appearance only. The painting is structured, but not according to conventional landscape rules, with clearly established foreground, middle ground, and distance. As Tim Clark has argued, the stooping peasant figure at this stage in Pissaro's career still an unemphatic indicator in the agricultural landscape, is nevertheless the linchpin of the illusion. The direction of his footsteps serves to locate the road mentioned in the title, whose position would otherwise remain obscure. As has already been pointed out by John House, the most extreme stylistic effects that critics persuaded themselves and their readers were typical of the new art were only visible in a few of the works on show in 1874. Such effects were essentially to be found in the work of the landscapists. Figure compositions such as Degas' ballet class, shown at the 1874 exhibition, were not unfinished or sketchy, nor did they show a preoccupation with sunlight, though one could certainly make a case for Degas' interest in the effects created by artificial light. Unconventional and challenging they certainly were, but no contemporary critic could say they lacked draftsmanship or a considered design. A final characteristic of Impressionist paintings that all critics in the 1870s remarked upon, and here there was a link between the landscapists and the figure painters, was their apparent disregard for the traditional hierarchies of subject matter. Any motif seemed to be treated by the new group of painters as a suitable subject. The most unprepossessing corners of nature were now deemed worthy to be painted. Pissaro's frost-covered ploughed field, for instance, or Cézanne's House in Auvers, now known as the House of the Hanged Man. The most mundane aspects of modern life, laundresses, prostitutes, shopgirls, barmaids, or dancers in rehearsal, stretching and scratching or slumped in exhaustion. Because of their abandonment of traditional imagery, of historical and heroic themes, Manet and the Impressionists were judged by their contemporaries to be deliberately setting out to subvert all established canons of subject matter, which in this sense they were. But by extension, their works were considered empty of content, lacking in meaning. This was not quite the point. Here, contemporaries and subsequent modernist admirers of Impressionism seem to have been unwilling or unable to see beyond the novel aspects of the painted surface to what was being represented. They did not bother to reflect, for instance, on what specific social realities underscored Monet's representations of figures in La Grenouillère, or indeed Manet's in the bar at the Folies Bergère, realities to which Tim Clark has drawn attention. Only since the later 1970s have art historians consistently begun to realize how indispensable it is to situate these images in their social contexts. In the case of Degas' dance class, for example, we fail to realize the full range of meanings in the picture unless we know about the backstage life of the dancer, the stern discipline from the age of 8, the insecurity of her career, the customary attempts by her mother to procure her a wealthy lover amongst bourgeois opera-goers. Because these realities were not discussed by critics at the time, does not mean that they were not tacitly and perhaps uncomfortably acknowledged. Today, we misread the painting if we choose to see it only as a daring composition on the theme of movement. As we have seen, the term Impressionism raised problems from the first. It lumped together artists who, on closer scrutiny, turn out to have had very different styles, interests, and working methods. In the 1880s and 1890s, these problems were exacerbated as the movement gained followers and the term became more widely used. There were two contradictory developments. To some, Impressionism came to mean no more than modern subjects painted in a modern style. The term became virtually synonymous with advanced or radical. To others, the term assumed a much more doctrinaire meaning and came to be associated almost exclusively with Monet, whose stylistic development in paintings such as this, Cliffs at Varengeville, seemed to confirm those observations critics had made in the early years. The Impressionist was increasingly seen as a painter for the eye alone, content merely to record his visual sensations without thought or preparation. In this painting of 1888, the American painter John Singer Sargent enshrines the view of Monet as the archetypal impressionist, working out of doors directly onto the canvas. It was known that Monet would sometimes brave inclement weather in order to capture an elusive effect. He chose more and more difficult sights and motifs. In particular, he became increasingly preoccupied by the shifting reflections on water, as here in the Seine at Port-Villez. In 1911, the English painter Walter Sickert wrote, "Two persistent errors may now be found in nearly all writers on the Impressionists. The first, that Impressionism was limited to the effects of colour and implied the absence of composition or pattern in a design. The second, that Impressionist pictures were all painted on the spot, or as people say, from nature." Sickert's diagnosis of the cause of this tendency was the interest of the more prestigious Paris art dealers in promoting the late work of Monet, those series of haystacks, poplars, and, as we see here, water lilies. Thanks to Durand-Ruel's manoeuvres, Monet's reputation had already crossed the Atlantic, and his pictures, with their luminous colour and decorative, inoffensive subject matter, were being bought there almost as soon as they were completed. It was essentially this view of Impressionism that was accepted and canonized by modernist critics and historians in the late 1930s and 40s, some of whom went so far as to see Impressionism as having relevance to, if not a direct influence on, American abstract expressionism. From the dealer's point of view, Pissarro was always a less saleable commodity than Monet. One reason for this was his uncompromising commitment to painting peasants honestly and without sentimentality. And as Tim Clark has shown, in paintings such as apple picking, it was an endeavour that posed him difficulties of a technical kind. His tendency to worry at his surface, and from time to time to overhaul his painting style, was another factor that inhibited commercial success. Pissarro's obvious dependence upon preparatory work and upon reworking in the studio did not easily square with the notion of Impressionism as an art of spontaneity and empirical observation. It is only quite recently that Pissarro has gained the status he deserves as a major exponent of Impressionism and probably its main intellectual force. But we now know that this notion of Impressionism was a somewhat misleading one, even in the case of Monet. As Anthea Callan has shown, in later years, Monet no longer restricted himself to painting on the spot, but supplemented his plein air work with ever more elaborate and artful finishing procedures in the studio. When Roger Fry mounted his exhibition Manet and the Post-Impressionists in 1910, it caused a considerable furore in the press. The ensuing debates helped to establish Post-Impressionism as a new category, or pseudo-category, in the history of art, at least among English-speaking artists, art historians, and museum curators. Today, the term has even been accepted in France, and it is used as a convenient package, lumping together the many and varied developments in advanced art that followed on from Impressionism, either building upon or reacting against Impressionist practice. But it is clear that what Fry meant by the term was something more specific, more akin to anti-Impressionism, or even anti-naturalism. Fry's tastes had been formed by a study of classical and Renaissance art. He looked to art to express emotion through its intrinsic formal elements, line, mass, colour. He felt that with the Impressionists, and he was presumably thinking above all of Monet, these organs of expression had become so fused together, so lost in the flux of appearance, that they ceased to deliver any intelligible message. He was convinced that in what he considered the more advanced French painters, such as Gauguin, Cézanne, and Matisse, he could detect a united reaction against Impressionism, a return to tradition, and a concern to reassert the expressiveness of the whole design. Looking at these works today, what strikes one most forcibly, perhaps, is their dissimilarity. They seem to represent such very different interests on the parts of their authors. How could Fry or his contemporaries see in such disparate works, and in artists so widely varying in age and outlook, some sort of a formal coherence, a movement even? Part of the answer must surely lie in Fry's relative ignorance. To call Cézanne a post-impressionist and to show the Maison du Pendu, a work, if you remember, that was shown at the first Impressionist exhibition in 1874, alongside works such as this, Matisse's Woman in Front of a Window, was nonsense from a historical point of view. And there were numerous other strange inclusions and exclusions from Fry's exhibition. But part of the answer also lies in the generality of the characteristics Fry identified as being post-impressionist. In a painting such as this, Gauguin's Harvest, Le Pouldu, it is easy enough to see which features seem to announce a stylistic departure from Impressionism. Comparing this landscape of an agricultural scene to a roughly equivalent subject by Pissarro, one is undoubtedly struck, as Fry was, by the simplification of Gauguin's drawing and colour. Here there is no complicated build-up of brush strokes to suggest changes in light and texture.